Welcome back to Amplified. A decade ago, we had no idea how many police-involved killings actually occurred. Now we do, thanks to a new study published in world-renowned medical journal, The Lancet. The scientific report found that for the last 30 years, medical examiners misclassified and underrepresented 55% of deaths nationwide at the hands of police. Not only that, it also uncovered where the mortality rate is highest and who is being killed. According to the report, Oklahoma is the deadliest state in the country because of police violence, and overall, black people, particularly our men, are killed at higher rates. Oklahoma State Representative Monroe Nichols has been fighting and legislating since 2016 to turn this deadly trend around, and he is here with us tonight. Representative Nichols, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Amplified. This bombshell study revealed that black people in Oklahoma account for 6 out of every 10 police homicide victims. As a representative of the state, why does this impact black people, especially black men there, disproportionately? And are you surprised by these findings?
You know, and I'm glad to be here tonight. I want to thank you for lifting up this issue and bringing some attention to this particular issue in the state of Oklahoma. We know it's a national, another national pandemic. And you know what? It doesn't shock me, and I think that's the saddest thing about it. I don't think it shocks any of us. But I think the frustrating thing about it has been ever since we've had these conversations around officer-involved killings or uses of deadly force, we always have an issue in how the data is kept, right? We never really get a full picture of how these things are happening in communities. And so what happens is we have to rely on the experience of black men, of African Americans across the board, and we're never listened to. And so I'm glad that the study was done because I'm hoping that it continues to get us to a place where we can actually have a conversation about how do we change it. This is an issue that touches far too many states, far too many communities. Tulsa being one of them. We already have our history of the race massacre and those types of things. And the fact that nobody's really taking collective action on this particular issue means that we can only expect more of the same, right? There's not been enough done in Oklahoma, I know for sure, and I look forward to talking about that. And I don't think there's been enough done nationally to curb those statistics, right? I'm not super surprised by it, but what is surprising and shocking is how we lose focus on what we have to do to turn those numbers around.
Well, let's talk about the data. Let's talk about the numbers. The report also uncovered that 84% of police killings in your state that happened between 1980 and 2018 were unreported or misclassified in official government data.
Right.
So why is there this discrepancy in the information? In other words, why is it so hard to actually keep track of how often police kill people?
Yeah, it's not hard to keep track of it. It's folks who don't want to keep track of it, right? We can track just about anything. We found out on January 6th that from your cell phone, people can tell where you were if you didn't do anything, right? We know that we can track all kinds of things. We choose not to track some things, right? And so one of the core pieces of legislation that we offered up last year was the data piece, right? That we ensured that anytime that there was a use of force, particular use of deadly force, that not only was that documented, but we documented the reason if an officer was had some disciplinary action taken against him, then that was documented. If it was decided that that officer didn't deserve disciplinary action, that was also documented, right? Part of the challenge is the fact that we don't have good data, but the reason why we don't have good data is because nobody's mandating that it happens, and nobody's double checking to make sure that it happened, right? So it is, and I think we all remember when George Floyd was killed in Minnesota. I don't know if folks remember, the first report was that he had a medical episode during an arrest, right? It wasn't until that we saw the video that
Yes.
changed. So George Floyd could have very easily been somebody, right, who had the same thing happen. And so what we're finding out is that the George Floyd situation is not in a vacuum, right? We're finding out that this is something that's been happening for a very, very long time. And as I said before, if you go to a lot of our black communities, right, dating back to the 80s and before, they would have told us the same thing. So what we know is we have folks that have been for a very, very long time, not just underreporting numbers, because underreporting numbers could be, a mistake or a fluke. This has been an effort to hide the truth about the dangers
Oh,
that
yeah.
happen with interactions with the police. And let me
Yeah,
be
because they're
clear
trying to
about
shape their
something.
own narrative.
That's
Hmm.
exactly right. We
Yeah, go
have
ahead.
a real cultural, we have a cultural problem in law enforcement in Oklahoma and across the country. And I want to be clear, my dad's a police officer, my uncle's still a police officer. I got friends that are police officers who have deep community connections. Everybody knows their name. They walk the streets, they do all the great things. And that is the lion's share of police officers, right? But the fact is, when something goes wrong, the lion's share of those police officers aren't always stepping up to talk about what's going wrong on one end. But on the other end, in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, and this might not be something you come across, we had a major, so we had a leader in the police department when in the conversation last year about black shootings by police officers said that based on his data that the Tulsa Police Department shot blacks 24% less than they should. That is a quote. And so that is a cultural problem, right? That is folks saying that,
Wow.
hey, guess
Wow.
what? Actually, we're not doing as much as we ought to be doing it, right? And so when we talk about reforms, in his mind, the reform is that people just understand we ought to be shooting people more. The reform is not, we need to be thinking about these other practices that we could be employing and maybe, have
So,
a deeper conversation with the community with this.
so have you actually talked to the Oklahoma Association of Chiefs of Police about this? I'm curious what they had to say.
Yeah, so it's really interesting about that. I mentioned one piece of the police reform legislation that we offered up last year, and we had a number of other reforms to go with it that included getting a database of officers that left or resigned due to disciplinary action. A, to make sure that those officers that we had database, but B, to help other law enforcement agencies that wanted to make sure that they weren't hiring folks who had a bad record. Because what we see all the time across the country, another issue people don't talk about is an officer may resign to get themselves out of a disciplinary action, but they may get hired two towns over, right? There's no tracking of that type of stuff. But when we offered up these reforms, many of which were common sense reforms, we weren't even talking about getting rid of qualified immunity or anything like that. The chairman of the committee, the public safety committee, when I had a conversation with him about these bills, just getting them a hearing in the House of Representatives, he said that he wasn't going to hear them. The reason why he said he wasn't going to hear them because the police don't like him. And so we have this deal where we're allowing folks to govern themselves. And there's not any other time in government where we do that. And there is not anybody else in our society that has as much discretion over whether you go home or not or anything like that than a police officer. After that's a DA. After that's a judge. But it starts with a police officer, right? If you leave the studio today and you're exceeding the speed limit by 2 or 3 miles an hour, you get pulled over. Nobody else has the power to do
Mm-hmm.
that to you. And so that means it doesn't mean that police
Mm-hmm.
officers shouldn't do their job. It means that there has to be a high level of accountability, a high level of transparency. And then when things go wrong, we have to make sure that we course correct. And that's something that there's no interest in doing from a policymaking standpoint in Oklahoma. And that's why these statistics don't surprise me. And that's why it frustrates me that those statistics may never change because they're only going to change
Mm.
when the police department decides so, not necessarily when legislators step up and do what's right.
So, are you hopeful at all? Tell me what you might be hopeful about, given that you know that it's really hard to hold police departments accountable. What can legislatures do?
I actually think this is not just a conversation for legislators, man. This is a community conversation, right? We can't allow just when a George Floyd situation or Terrence Crutcher who was killed in Tulsa, when those things happen to be the things that get us a call for reform and then we back off of it over time. This is something that we have to be focused on because it does impact everybody, right? It impacts black males more than anybody else, but it impacts everybody. And so we have to be in a place in a position that every time it's time for a police chief to get hired, every time there's a mayor's race or a city council's race, every time there's a conversation in the community about what we're going to do to make our community better, this issue has to be front and center. You can't have safe communities if we have statistics like we have right now, because those communities, frankly, are not safe. Why does a black man who
Mm.
may be in trouble, a black family who may be in trouble, why would they call the police, right? There could be a disincentive to
Mm-hmm.
call if you're in trouble. Why? Because you could be on the other end of a gun. And I'm really interested, and I have not found this data anywhere. Um, I mentioned my family, my friends are police officers. It is a
Mm-hmm.
dangerous job. It is a very honorable job. Um, as
Mm-hmm.
best I can
Mm-hmm.
tell, and I might be wrong about this, and I want to find the data on this. There have been a number of police officers who have been tragically killed in Oklahoma as well. Um, as
Oh,
best I can
interesting.
tell, as long as I've been in
That's
the
a
legislature, there's not been one killed by a black man. So this perceived danger that comes with being black is not real in the data when it comes to
Oh, it's
those
all
who choose to shoot back at
inflammatory.
police officers. Absolutely.
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 And
And
that's
we
the
see that all
frustrating thing
across the
there.
country. Yep. Representative Nichols, I so appreciate you coming on and sharing all of this and the work that you are doing in Oklahoma. Thank you so much for joining Amplified tonight.